don't do it for money, do it because you love it. That's really important. I have spent maybe 20 hours some days doing this, and you have to just enjoy what you're doing.
What's going on, guys? It's your boy, Tom Talks Rush, and stand back for another interview. This time, I'm joined by the one and only Sarah O'Connell from The Sarah O'Connell Show. So welcome to the show, my friend.
Thank you so much for inviting me on here. I'm really excited to talk to you about everything wrestling and talk some rubbish too.
I love when people lean into the username, I'm not going to lie. So, if we take this back to the very beginning, Sarah, where do you first discover wrestling as an overall fan?
So to age myself slightly, or rather a lot, I grew up in the 1980s, and back then my family used to watch UK wrestling, and there was only one TV in the house, so I just watched what everyone else was watching. So I had no choice, and I was only about 4. So I kind of got into it then and got to know all the different wrestlers, Giant Haystacks and Big Daddy and all that good stuff. And then it wasn't until 1990 when a friend down the road recorded WWE or WWF pay-per-view, as it was at the time, Survivor Series 1990, and I watched it, and I was just captivated by all the different characters and all the stuff going on. It was, the main event was Hulk Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior versus a bunch of people, and it was the debut of The Undertaker. There was the Gobbledygooker, so it was a huge night for wrestling. I've been hooked ever since.
What was your thoughts on the Gobbledygooker as a child?
Tremendous. You know, it was a lot of hype. You don't very often see like a 6-foot egg hatch with a dancing, fully grown gobbledygooker. And I'm just disappointed that he didn't get a title run. I think he did make a comeback in a gimmick battle royal at one point, but I would have still liked to see a lot more gobbledygooker.
What would your thoughts be if something like that debuted now, though?
Just massive excitement.
Really?
Yeah, they had an egg for weeks and it launched, and there's just like a dancing bird in there. So I think at the time, back in 1990, so Survivor Series is the Thanksgiving pay-per-view in America. So the idea was that the Gobbledygooker was going to be the annual Survivor Series mascot. And I don't think that the character was that popular, so they just didn't mention the Gobbledygooker again.
I actually never knew that. That's very interesting. So when you discover wrestling in 1990, are you someone that's like, I need to watch everything that I can find? Or are you someone that's like, this is cool, but I'll come back to it later?
Yeah, it was very much the first one. So I was just interested to learn more about the characters and the storylines, because it was alluded to that some of them had rivalries, and I didn't know anything about that. So I decided back then, so wrestling was on Sky TV, which I did not have. But I would, you know, with my pocket money, start getting some of the older pay-per-views. I think the first one I got was probably WrestleMania 6. So that was a bit earlier on in the Hogan Warrior feud that they had. And then I went back, I think, to the very beginning, and I'd watch, you know, WrestleMania 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I started watching the Survivor Series, SummerSlam, Royal Rumbles as well. And that's kind of how it started. And it wasn't until I think I know this for certain, it was just before WrestleMania 8 that I finally we got cable TV and watched WrestleMania 8 live, like really super late at night, and that was the first time I did that, and then I've just watched it ever since.
What was some of the ultimate like differences? That was the word I was looking for. Why did my brain not work? What were some of the differences you immediately noticed when you watched wrestling live compared to watching it on tape delay?
One was I was a lot more tired. The first thing I actually noticed was, I think WrestleMania 8 was in Indianapolis, Indiana. And for some reason, I want to say it was on the 5th of April, 1992. My brain should have useful things in it, but it's got nonsense like that. And the arena, or the stadium, was, I noticed that the ceiling was white, and I wasn't used to seeing wrestlers in daytime. It was really weird to me. Usually it'd be in these small arenas, you know, WWE superstars, and stuff like that. And it was all very sort of black, but it was weird to see them in this completely new environment with a bigger stage. And I don't think they had much pyro at that point, but you know, a few fireworks maybe. And yeah, it's just everything was on a bigger scale. And certainly compared to the British wrestling that I'd been watching.
You brought up the British wrestling you'd watched there. When you discovered wrestling, did you get your family into the Americanized wrestling, or was that
as I say, we only had one television, so we kind of all had no choice.
Oh yeah.
We'd all watch a lot of stuff that the other people weren't necessarily into, but we all just sort of enjoyed it.
No, I understand completely there. We're jumping ahead a little bit. I know you moved to the States.
I did live there for a while, yes.
The years have escaped me. My brain's gone blank. I do apologize.
It was alarmingly coming up to 20 years now. It'll be 20 years later this year. But yeah, so I lived over there for a year, which was fun.
So when you lived over there, how did that change your wrestling fandom at all?
Well, the first thing it did was allow me to go to, I'd been to a few live events in the UK, but when I lived in America, I went to WrestleMania 21 and I went to some Raw events and SmackDowns and stuff like that.
So what was your initial thoughts of going to WrestleMania?
So my initial thought was, so WrestleMania 21 was at the Staples Center in LA, and they'd closed the entire area down. You couldn't get a car or a taxi anywhere near it. So I had to walk quite a long distance, but it was exciting. I didn't really know what to expect. Didn't have the best tickets, but I was just excited to be in the room. And then a few years later, I moved back to the UK at that point, and I went back to America for WrestleMania 24, which was in Florida.
What was your biggie, if we go back to those two manias, which experience did you prefer the most?
I think 24, because I was kind of missing America at that point, and you know, I spent the whole week. What did I do? I went to Disneyland and Universal and Kennedy Space Center, and you can go out on these boats with giant fans on the back of them, and then go and see like the alligators. So that was interesting. I think I saw that in one of the Police Academy films, so I just had to do it. WrestleMania was a huge experience. It was an outdoor arena. And it was the one famously where pyro, is a bad incident actually, the pyro broke and fell into the audience. I think some people were hospitalized.
I believe that was during the main event, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, and I was sat on the other side of the arena, but it was still scary. No one knew what was going on.
What was that moment like? You talk about it being scary. Did you have a moment of like, oh, like, I don't know what to do during that moment?
It was just kind of, as I said, I was on the other side of the arena, and we weren't really sure what was going on, and you couldn't see the people that closely to see if anyone had actually been hit or injured by the falling. I think it was a cable which had pyro attached to it, and I think it broke, and the pyro continued to fire off into the audience. So yeah, that was kind of scary.
I understand completely there. So I'm very curious to know, you talked about your wrestling fandom changing when you went to the States. Was there any habits you made in the States to watch wrestling that you had to get out of when you moved back to the UK?
Not really. I've always been kind of nocturnal. So I think I've watched every episode of Raw and SmackDown live, pretty much. Wow. Unless I'm doing something in particular and I'm like, you know, if I was, especially in my 20s, I might be in a nightclub or something, but I would most of the time come back just in time for it to be on. So I've pretty much watched it consistently every single week.
You talk about watching it consistently every week. Yeah. Was there ever a moment that you were like, okay, I need to stop this now. This isn't fun anymore.
All right. That hasn't happened yet, but I would say that in the mid 1990s, a lot of the wrestlers that I'd been watching kind of emigrated over to WCW, which was harder to watch. I was still watching WWE, but it wasn't easy to catch up with WCW back then.
Very, very cool. So you talk about it not being easy to catch up on WCW. How big of a WCW fan were you back then, for one, if you didn't have that much access to it? And what's your thoughts on WCW now, almost 23 years after its closure.
So there were some magazines that you could get which would have the results in them. I remember in particular going back to the first match I saw that had Hogan and Warrior in it, that there had been a rematch, I think at Halloween Havoc, between the two of them, but by which point it was Hollywood Hogan, and so he was the bad guy. And I think I read about that match, so I didn't even get to see it to start with. I caught up when WWE Network existed and you could just go watch anything. Looking back on it, I think it was really important that the second organization existed, and it gave other superstars a chance to debut and other ones a new home if they weren't necessarily happy in WWE. And I think that competition, the Monday Night Wars, as it was, between Vince McMahon and Eric Bischoff, encouraged both of them to be more competitive and try more things. And I think back at the time, WWE used to have, they'd have, I don't know, Hacksaw Jim Duggan versus the Brooklyn Brawler, and you wouldn't see him, Hacksaw Jim Duggan versus like Macho Man or Sergeant Slaughter or someone until the pay-per-view. But then WCW was doing pay-per-view quality matches every single week, and it forced WWE to try and think more outside the box and have more different matches to make it more worth tuning in.
I understand what you're saying completely there. When competition comes back in wrestling in 2019, I know we're jumping around a lot. That's just how my interviews go. I do apologize. So when competition comes back in 2019, how does that change your fandom again?
So you're talking about AEW, right?
Correct.
I love AEW.
Okay.
And it was really exciting. And so to take a step back before that, obviously the next biggest contender for WWE would have been TNA, or which then became Impact Wrestling, then became TNA again. But it kind of fizzled out a bit in 10 years ago or so. And then when AEW came back, it was exciting, and they were getting the biggest wrestlers from Japan, and they were getting really huge people coming over from WWE all the time, and it was just interesting. I always wanted to tune in every Wednesday night and see what was going on. I still do, and I always get the pay-per-views as well. And yeah, it's given me quite a lot of content to try and keep up with every week now, but I'm enjoying it. Some weeks on every show are better or worse than others, but overall, I think wrestling's in the best place it's been for a long time.
You talk about wrestling being in the best place it's been in for a long time. If I was to ask you, where's your current fandom now? Obviously, you talked about your love for AEW, but where is your current fandom as we record this in March of 2024?
Sure. So I would say that it's not that I'm loyal to one or the other. I just enjoy all of it. And there's some people that have been on my show that I kind of consider friends now. And, I enjoy seeing them thrive wherever it is. It can be in WWE or AEW or TNA or New Japan. And I try and watch as much as I can. And then sometimes if I happen to miss an episode or something, I'll try and see clips of it and keep up to date that way. But yeah, I think it's a good time for all the organizations at the moment. They're all doing creative things. They've all got really good rosters, too many people in some instances, and they're all sort of fighting for TV time every week. But I think that's a good thing.
100%. So you did the small segue of your great show that is this Sarah O'Connell show. And so how does that come about? How do you get into this crazy world of YouTube and podcasting?
Sure. So I've in the past, I've got a degree in animation, and I studied media studies and film and all that good stuff. And I've always loved interviewing people. And I used to do written ones and do things on the radio, and I've done some stuff in television, but I always wanted to have my own YouTube show. And it took me a while to work out what the structure of that was going to be, and it took me 2 seconds to work out what it was called. I just obviously put show at the end of my name. And then so that's easy bet. And yeah, so my show has interviews with actors, directors, stand-up comedians, authors, musicians, and wrestlers, and more. I've had Guinness World Record holders, Olympic gold medalists, people that have sold out Madison Square Garden, New York Times bestselling authors. And it's just me celebrating people I love, and films and TV shows and all that good stuff, and talking to the people that help create it.
That's very, very cool. You talked about the list of people you've had on, such as Dawn French, Eric Bischoff, and people like that. And when it comes to finding a niche, do you ever have a worry that like you're going to be like not have a niche which might not help your channel grow? I'm really not trying to offend you. I'm just
I know, and I know
really curious.
exactly what you mean. It's kind of, yeah, because someone might watch a wrestling interview, for example, and then go, great, I'm subscribing. Then I upload a comedy one, and then they unsubscribe. I kind of don't care. It's called the Sarah Connell Show because it's stuff I like. And if you happen to like that stuff, great. And, you know, I have separate playlists, so you can follow the playlist. And then when I add a new interview with a comedian or an actor or an author or whoever, then you'll get new content from that section of my show. And I always try to approach it so that even if you don't know who the guest is, if you have a loose interest in that area whatsoever, you're not just going to find out what their latest project is. I celebrate people's entire careers. So you'll find out their first time on stage, their first demo tape, their first audition, all the way through to them becoming really successful in their latest project. But if you want to become an actor, you'll get advice from the best people in the world. If you want to understand more about wrestling, then you'll hear stories from people that have been on the road maybe 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And you can use that as a jumping off point to go and watch more stuff if you'd like to do that.
What has been your sort of area that you're like, because you talked about again all the areas that you cover in pop culture, and what is the area that you look into most and you're like, I'd love to get an interview with this person in this section this year, I'd love to get a person from this section, etc.
It's literally, I mean, genuinely, because I don't have to interview anyone that I don't want to, and I get offered them sometimes, and I just think, I'm going to spend a week researching this. I need to really enjoy it. So everyone that comes on my show, I just love their stuff. And it could be that I'm in the mood to interview an animation director, or I've just watched a TV show that I love and I think I'd like to speak to the writers about that, or a stand-up comedian that I saw live. And I kind of just am aware of the world around me, and anything I'm enjoying or things I've enjoyed in the past, that's what influences who I have on my show.
What is your process for, first of all, getting a guest, such as someone big like Dawn French?
I've genuinely just today, but I get asked this more than anything else. And I've just filmed a video about exactly how I do it, which I think you'll enjoy. But the short version is I'd ask them.
Fair. So are you sliding into DMs? Are you emails, etc.?
Yeah, it depends on the person. Sometimes you have to speak to their agents or whatever it is. And sometimes a guest will come on my show, say a stand-up comedian, and then they'll recommend my show to other stand-up comedians, and then they'll contact me through them, which is nice. And some guests, such as Stephen Bailey, who I interviewed today, a stand-up comedian, this was his 4th appearance. So some guests, you know, I then become friends with them and we keep in contact. And I'm just like, you've got a new tour out. Would you like to come and talk about it? And that sort of thing happens too.
You talk about Stephen Bailey, it being his 4th appearance on the show. How is it different to interview someone for the first time and then have them on for the 4th time, for example?
Yeah, well, the good thing about comedians is they're always doing stuff. So they're either working on their new tour or they're quite often on a lot of TV shows. So Stephen Bailey has hosted Takeshi's Castle. He's been on What I Lied to You. When I spoke to him last time, he'd just been on Live at the Apollo. This time he just hosted it. And there's a TV show called Madame Blanc, which was on Channel 5. He guest starred in an episode of that. So the great thing about comedians is they're always working on new stuff, and there's always exciting new stuff to talk about with them.
What about if it isn't a comedian, if it's just somebody in general, and you've interviewed from any niche and you've interviewed them multiple times? How do you make every interview feel different and authentic?
I'll say the important thing is I'll only invite them on my show if I feel like there is something to talk about. So I wouldn't, if I interviewed someone about their entire career and they haven't done anything since that, I'm not going to invite them back on until there's something else to talk about, or a different part of their career that maybe I didn't visit the first time. So Eric Bischoff, for example, has been on my show twice, and we spoke about some of the stuff he did in WCW and WWE. But then the second time I picked completely different stuff and came at the interview from different angles.
I understand what you're saying completely there. How do you deal with either burnout or imposter syndrome when it comes to interviews? Do you suffer from burnout and imposter syndrome at all?
I think so. In the early days, when I used to go to like press junkets or conferences or whatever it was, you'd sometimes have 250 journalists from perhaps all around the world at really respected companies. And then I'm just there as a freelancer by myself, and you can sometimes feel out of place. But, I just think I earn my spot in this building and just do my best like everyone else is. And if anything, it's harder when you're just doing it by yourself. And I think that my work at this point speaks for itself and the guests I've had on my show. So I kind of, that doesn't trouble me anymore. I've been doing it for long enough. What's the other part of your question? Sorry.
Burnout.
Burnout. Yes, I'm always tired. That is a problem. So I'd say most of the guests that come on my show now are in the United States or Canada, sometimes Australia. And so their time, their schedule in which they're sort of up and operating and things is kind of similar to mine. I actually struggle more if it's a UK person and they want to speak to me in the morning. It's because that's like 3 a.m. to me. Like 9-10 in the morning UK time is the middle of the night for me. Burnout. So because I'm entirely self-sufficient doing my show, I source the guests myself. I produce, direct, I do the camera when I'm out somewhere, and I obviously write the interviews and present the interview as well. And then I edit it, I market it, I do all that stuff. I kind of feel compelled to keep going relentlessly. So usually the second an interview is finished, that hour afterwards, it's when I'm 99 times more likely to arrange my next interview. So I'm just kind of really hyper focused on doing that.
You get that burst of creativity, don't you?
It's a problem.
I've had that. Yeah. It's a problem, particularly if an interview finishes at like 11 p.m. my time. It's like
most of mine do.
Rain, we need to sleep. We don't need these creative energies right now. Well, that's how I feel anyway.
Yeah, I've been in bed at 5 a.m. and just had to get back out of bed because I've had an idea. Then I start writing a script for something or whatever it is. And I like that though, because I enjoy doing it. I get burnt out more if I've been editing for 12, 14 hours a day for like 7 days or something. That will tire me. And then I'll try and schedule a day, even though I don't like doing it, to just not do anything. And usually on that day, I'm still doing quite a lot because I'm not very good at just sitting there. I have to like do stuff.
What do you do to sort of combat that not being very good at doing stuff? Are you one of those people that has to lock their phone in another room, lock the laptop in another room, things like that?
That would be bad for me. So there's loads of stuff I'm into doing. So for example, I just enjoy catching up with reading. I love art still, and I always have an iPad next to me and I'll just be drawing something or whatever it is, or just thinking about ideas for my show, but just giving my eyes a rest, I guess, from sitting close to a screen and doing stuff for 10, 12 hours. I try and give myself time to do that. But then I'll decide, right, today I'm going to go to the cinema. I'm going to watch a bunch of movies that came out in the last few weeks I've been meaning to watch. And then usually by the end of it, I've arranged an interview with someone in it. So I don't know why bother.
I know what you mean, though. So you talked about always wanting to do this and doing this because you want to do this.
Yeah.
If you didn't want to do this anymore and you stepped away,
Yeah.
first of all, would you view your podcast show as a success? And then second of all, what do you want your legacy as a podcast?
Right. So I believe my show is a success because I've done it to the best of my ability. And that this isn't just my show, this is anything. I think no matter what you're doing, even if it's the first time you're doing something, if you try your absolute best to do it, and even if it doesn't go well, and you're like, oh, I completely screwed that up, but you know you gave it your best shot, then there's nothing to regret. There's nothing to feel bad about. And I always try and give my show my best. And sometimes some interviews go better than others, or, you know, when you're first starting out, you might forget to press record, or the batteries in your microphone run out, stuff like that. You just learn from it. And then as you progress, you hopefully get better and better. I'd hope that the legacy of my show is that I always try to educate, inspire, and hopefully entertain people. And while I sometimes have been lucky enough to interview some of the biggest stars on the entire planet, I also like shining a spotlight on a first-time director or an author, for example, such as TJ Newman, who had never done an interview before. I was literally her first ever one. And then she came on my show and her book came out, and then she became a New York Times bestselling author, and then she came back on my show a second time and she wanted to do it again. I think she thought it was good luck, which was amazing. And then we spoke about her second book. So yeah, I love doing stuff like that.
Very, very cool. So you talk about the interviewing someone who's just starting out, and then the second time you might have them on, they might be a bit more successful. Who is someone that you've had on that you're maybe like, you talked about an author, but who is someone that maybe you had on in the early days that you're like, I'm so happy to see your success?
Tom Cruise has done great things as I'm really proud of him, how far he's gone since I gave him that opportunity. Yeah, no, he's obviously doing amazingly well. There's loads of people. So people like Joe Lycett, who I first interviewed backstage at this really tiny club. And then, you know, you see people like him and Catherine Ryan, who I once saw perform upstairs in a pub as well, like a really tiny venue. And then you see them doing 20-minute sets somewhere, and then they've got their own show, and then they're in a bigger building, and then they've got their own Netflix special, or they're on TV, or they're hosting something. I love that.
You talked about them achieving their goals and getting bigger and things like that. What are some of your goals for the Sarah O'Connell show, though, Sarah?
Good question. So obviously to have just more amazing guests. One of them in the early days was just to have things like a microphone, which I amazingly didn't have. I just had the inbuilt one in my PC. So things like that.
Recently, so did I.
I can relate. Yeah. You've got to do these things one at a time, right? Now I have a webcam, which doesn't look like a phone from the 1990s. So that's a bit better. Now have lighting so people can see my face. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Apologies if it isn't. My best lighting, I say, is always in the cinema when the lights have gone off. But
as someone that works in the cinema, not so much.
Amazing. I'd say one goal for my show eventually is I'd like to do it live on stage.
I saw this tweet.
Yeah, so that's something I've been thinking about for a long time. And yeah, at some point, I think it's going to happen.
How is it different? How do you approach interviews differently? For example, how do you approach, should I say? It's very late in the day, I'm not going to lie. How do you approach
I'm sorry about this. I'm on American time, as I told you.
It's all good. How do you approach an in-person interview rather than a Zoom interview? And how do you approach maybe an hour-long interview as opposed to a press junket?
So I would say that, right, so if you go to a film premiere, then what happens is they will say to you, here's a list of everybody that's going to be here. They give you a cheat sheet, which has got photos of all the people in attendance, the writer, the director, the stars, maybe some guests. And they'll say to you, is there anyone in particular you want to speak to, or are you happy to speak to everybody? Now, the fun thing about agreeing to everybody is you've got no idea who you're going to talk to. Just any guest could potentially come and say hi. And then you have nothing prepared because you don't even necessarily know who they are. And you have to try and work out who they are during the conversation. That's fun. A press junket. So you may have 200-300 people in the room with you, and there could be time for 10 or 15 questions, and just trying to get a question asked can be impossible. I try not to bother doing that too much these days. I used to, but as my show become more established and I have more sort of pick of who comes on my show, then I prefer these sort of in-depth interviews. I think are a lot better.
That's very, very cool. As we said, how do you talked about enjoying them in-depth interviews more? How do you approach an in-depth interview in terms of research and stuff like that? Because one of the biggest compliments I saw from watching your show for research was how deep you dive into the research of your guests, and then complimenting you on, oh, I've never been asked that question before. Like, that's very, very cool.
Thank you. Yeah. So that's really important to me. And so some people, when I'm thinking about having them on my show, I don't invite them. And so what I mean by that is, so I'll have a list of people that could potentially be on my show, and I'll just keep them in my mind. And then, you know, as I'm living my life and just watching TV, I'll pay attention to what they're in, what they're starring in, what's coming up. And then when I've got a good enough picture of that, I may invite them onto my show. And if I'm lucky enough for them to say yes, then I'll go into even more detail. But it's not like I'm discovering that person from scratch at that point. I've been paying attention to their career on purpose. So to the point where, you know, what kind of stuff are they posting on Instagram? How was your trip to America last week? I saw you hosted this thing on TV, blah, 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 whatever it is. And yeah, I think that I try and pick up as much as I can via osmosis, and then I'll watch everything that they've done. And so I genuinely will spend a week watching as much as is available. I'll just watch or listen to or read as much stuff as I can. And then it's just a case of what interests me while I'm watching it, what I'm curious about, what I'd like to speak about more.
I understand completely there. How does that work then when maybe you're interviewing I don't want to say an unknown, but a relatively unknown person who might not have a big social media following or been on a lot of podcasts or TV shows and things like that, and might only have one book out?
Yeah.
Like the person you spoke about earlier.
That is a lot more difficult, I would say. And I do that less just because it's harder, but it's still possible. And, you know, I was lucky enough for TJ Newman to send me her book in advance, and that is enough. That's enough for me. You know, it's reading the book and the story of how the book came into existence, and just talking about the storyline and the characters and the setting and all that stuff. And yeah, there's always tons of stuff to talk about. If there was a film coming out and I knew nothing about it and I had seen nothing, there was not a trailer, it's a lot harder to do that.
I understand what you're saying completely there, because as a fellow interviewer, I've done that before. How long would you give yourself between asking someone for an interview and then recording the interview? I know you said you like to do a week of research, but what's your sort of time frame in terms of things?
It really depends on the person. As I say, a week is normally good. If someone says I can do it in 2 days or what, like if someone said now that they could do an interview tomorrow and that's the only time that they can do it, I can make that happen. I had a comedian that I invited on my show that was over from America, and they'd been filming a TV show in England, say to me that they could do an interview, but they didn't confirm it until midnight, and we were doing it at 10 o'clock in the morning. And then they were flying out of England back to the United States. So I had from midnight till 10 a.m. to sleep, travel, and write an interview, and I did it.
Oh, wow. How did that feel then? Did that feel like a sense of accomplishment, for lack of a better word?
It is. It did. It's a challenge, but I enjoy that. I don't want to do that every day, but it can be done.
I understand. So we talked about what you want, your goals for the show and things like that. As one of the best interviewers out there, in my opinion, can you give some people some advice if maybe they want to start a show, build the connections you have, things like that?
Right. So the first thing I would say, don't do it for money, do it because you love it. That's really important. I have spent maybe 20 hours some days doing this. And you have to just enjoy what you're doing and don't expect to get A-listers on day one. Just work out how to interview people and interview local people that are doing something. It could be, I don't know, a local footballer or a local artist or just anyone. Just interview one of your parents, your brother, your sister, your friends. Just get the hang of it. Do that. Watch how other people do it as well, and just talk about stuff that you're interested in. The last thing you want to do is be interviewing people and you don't care about what they're doing and you've got no passion for it, because you just won't enjoy it and the interview won't be as good.
That is very, very cool. And some great advice that I will take on board, and I suggest future podcasters take on board. I'm not going to lie. This is a massively self-indulgent question, Sarah, before we wrap this up. But we've spoke for probably nearly half an hour now. Where can I improve? What did you enjoy? Things like that.
On your show? I think you're great. I really, the episodes I've watched, you asked really good questions and it was informative, and I learned about people hosting sites that I knew about the websites, but I didn't necessarily know about the people behind the scenes. And I thought that was really interesting. And yeah, I think you're doing a good job. Just keep it up, I would say.
I really appreciate that, Sarah. So as we look at wrapping this up, we are going to do a segment that I call generic wrestling questions. Those of you that have seen my interviews before will know this where I'll ask Sarah her favorite wrestling match, favorite pay-per-view card, such as Double or Nothing 2019, favorite wrestler's entrance theme, favorite tag team, and favorite wrestler. The questions I assume Sarah might be asked on social media, so now she'll have a place to be like, I have answered this. Please go watch this. So what's your favorite match of all time?
I'm going to have to say The Rock versus Hulk Hogan and WrestleMania 18, mostly because of the audience.
Is it the crowd reaction that gets you, sort of thing?
It's amazing, just the whole thing and the fact that they were reacting to it, and it always felt like they were influencing the match, and the whole thing was just electric, and it was two different generations colliding in this once in a lifetime matchup. And Hulk Hogan was kind of fresh back from WCW. The Rock was at the height of his popularity at the time. He's still massively popular, of course. And it just, the crowd elevated it even more than what it was. And I really enjoyed it for that.
That's very, very cool. What about your favorite overall pay-per-view card, such as Double or Nothing 2019?
Right. So I'm going to have to go back to Survivor Series 1990, because that was what got me hooked and interested in it. And there were wrestlers like Earthquake and the $1 Million Man, and as I say, The Undertaker debuted, and it was just an interesting concept for me, because I don't think I'd seen an elimination style group of tag teams that then progressed into a main event where all the goodies and baddies fought against each other in this big finale, and it was just fun. And so I'm going to go back to the one that originally captured my imagination and say Survivor Series 1990.
Do you think you'd be we'll carry on with genetic questions in a second. This is just a follow-up question.
Let's do it.
Do you think you'd be a wrestling fan if you hadn't discovered that paper?
I'd probably hate it. I don't know. Can you imagine if I'd watched a bad one? Then I don't know. It's an interesting question. I just think that the particular lineup at that show just interested me enough to see more of it. And I think just to start with, as I mentioned, that there were some storylines that they'd mentioned and rivalries. I just kind of wanted to understand more about that area. But then I started just moving further and further backwards. So once I'd watched all the pay-per-views from 1990, then I went back and saw WrestleMania 5 and Hulk versus Macho Man and Miss Elizabeth and all the stuff that was going on then. And then going back to WrestleMania 1 and seeing Mr. T and Muhammad Ali and Cyndi Lauper and the first ever one. And yeah, it just, my interest in it just grew, I think.
I understand what you're saying there. So what about your favorite wrestler's entrance theme?
Entrance theme. See, I was thinking about this, and I think all the ones I enjoy the most are ones that the crowd are involved with in some way.
Mm.
And, you know, at the moment I'm loving Cody Rhodes. Just there's loads of them
Wow.
there's only that bit of it, but I think I like that 1 second of it. It's a good second. Anything where the crowd really pops. All the classic ones, of course. Who do I like? See, the thing is too, I played quite a lot of the video games, so I just know the words to them. So I don't know if I necessarily have a favorite that I'd listen to as a song. Anything you can sing along to, I probably like.
So just for a picture's sake, because my editor will put a nice picture in, shall we say Cody Rhodes?
Let's go Cody Rhodes.
That's very, very cool. What about your favorite wrestling tag team?
Legion of Doom.
Why do they speak to you as a fan?
Right. So I'd never really seen American football shoulder pads before when I was a kid. And the fact that they had spikes on them, and I didn't know that they weren't real spikes and they were just made of foam, and it just seemed incredibly dangerous. And, you know, they had face paint and they were really strong and they were picking their opponents up over their heads, and they just seemed like a powerhouse duo of people. And some tag teams would have one strong one and one more technical one. A lot of the tag teams were more doing drop kicks and things like that, teams like the Rockers. But Legion of Doom really sort of stood out to me. And they just had a massive presence. And I remember at SummerSlam 1992 at Wembley, where they came out on motorbikes and they had Paul Ellering and some kind of dummy puppet thing.
Oh, what was his name?
That guy, yeah, whoever that was.
That's going to bug me, but I can't remember his name now.
Yeah, my brain is saying Spike, but I feel like that isn't correct.
No, it's a Dudley boy.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a person. I
can't remember.
I can't remember. I probably will remember it 4 seconds after this finishes.
I'll probably DM you and be like, it was.
Yeah, in 7 years' time, I'll randomly remember. It'll be too late. Yeah, so the Legion of Doom or the Road Warriors is my answer.
Well, and then finally, Sarah, the biggest generic question, in my opinion, who is your favorite overall wrestler?
Okay, so I have to give a shout out to my first one, which was Hulk Hogan. I would say Kurt Angle was a big one for me. And I don't think that Nick Nemeth, Dolph Ziggler, gets enough praise. He's in TNA at the moment. He's a New Japan champion, and I'd love to see him do a lot more.
That's very, very cool.
And also, can I just give a special shout out?
Please.
Rhea Ripley, Bayley, all the women's division are just amazing. And Asuka and Charlotte Flair and all of them are just spectacular, and I'm loving what they're doing.
That's very, very cool. So as we wrap this up, Sarah, obviously I want to say thank you for a great conversation. Thank you for coming on. But the question I end this show on is, I believe as content creators, people with social media, or even just people with social media, we're all sort of going to live forever in some very, very
That's exciting.
If you think about the world. So what is one piece of content you're like, I'd like to be remembered for that? And then what is one that you're like, yuck, please forget about that?
For a start, it'd be very silly for me to mention anything I wanted people to forget. So one piece of content. I don't know. Like, so when people ask me what my favorite interview of all time is, there are some in my head that are definitely, if I had to list some, I would list them, but I wouldn't. But I would just say that the last trailer I think I sent to you is a really good menu of what my show is. And so you can watch this 20-something minute. I know trailers are supposed to be 2 minutes long, but there's too many bits for my own show that I like. But I think that's a good encapsulation of the singers and the funny moments and just everything. So I would say that.
That's very, very cool. So as we wrap this up, Sarah, I want to say thank you for a great conversation. But please promote yourself. Where can the good people find you, your work, etc.?
Okay, thank you. First of all, I've really enjoyed this chat. It's been a lot of fun. You can find me on YouTube at the Sarah O'Connell Show. So youtube.com/Sarah O'Connell Show. Like, subscribe, all that good stuff. I'm also on Twitter, never calling it X because it is Twitter still. I'm on Instagram and TikTok and Threads and Facebook, and just search for Sarah O'Connell Show and you'll hopefully find me.
It's well worth doing, guys. Not only one of the hardest working people in this space, but one of the nicest as well. So if you guys like this, make sure you like, share and subscribe to Tom Talk Flourish on YouTube. Follow me on Twitter at Tom Talk Flourish, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye now.